Hello YouTube. I have interesting information from Yakutia, or Republic of Sakha, the Arctic Asian Russian land, in its own republic, and I bring more and more paranormal information from that land. Sometimes I have to look at the recently received Russian reports, and I just do simultaneous translation, so you have to excuse me if I can't do it as nicely and evenly as I want to, or as perfectly, but I do want to tell you about very unusual phenomena, because there is a whole world that is unknown to many people in the West, in Africa, in Asia, and other parts of the world, and it has to do with the largest country in the world called Russia, which has a lot of territories that are very hard to reach. Interesting people and really fascinating phenomena. I want to talk today about Chuchuna, or Muleni. It's the name given to the so-called wild people in the folklore of the Yakut and Evenki people and tribes. According to the ethnographic information from Russia, Chuchuna had very long hair, were dressed in animal skins, always carried bow and arrows. Their speech was very incoherent. They stole deer and food. They would attack people at night. They would shoot at them from bows and arrows or throw rocks at them. The folkloric information from the second part of the 20th century actually provided foundation for a scientific hypothesis about existence of the relic hominoid in northern Asia. Call it snowman if you want to. Interestingly, it was in April of 1929 that the Soviet newspaper Autonomная Yakutia published an article which was titled Chuchuna. It told the story that back even in the Tsarist times, in the Russian imperial times, in the northern Yakutia, there used to be beliefs about existence far, far in the north of an unknown people who were called Chuchuna. Every year they would be visible or found in the Buntai Ulus territory towards the small town of Zhigansk. Those who had observed them described them to have a very tall height and strong body. They had very long hair. They would dress in animal skins. They knew how to shoot from bows and arrows, and they knew how to run quickly. 2 or 3 of the Chuchuna were killed by the local hunters, who later were hiding so that there would not be criminal investigation or punishment. And also some years later, in the Soviet magazine Будущая Сибирь in 1933, an article was published written by somebody named whose last name was Dravert, and the title of the article was Wild People Muluna and Chuchuna. It described primeval people who lived in the northeastern Siberia. The Tungus people of the Ayano-Nelkan area called them Yulen. They were actually very dangerous, deathly dangerous for humans, who would cross the very unusual place, by the way, very dangerous place called Dyuzhengu-Ar Ridge. The Yakuts were fearful when they saw Mulen. These wild people had long hair. They had faces covered with fur. They were more or less about the size of an average human being. They were dressed in animal skins and had knives and bow and arrows. Again, their speech was incoherent, and probably they lived in caves. They would attack humans at night. They would shoot bows at them, shoot arrows at them, and they would throw rocks. They stole deer and food, and the last of the Mulen was killed in 1913 by some local Yakut person. So, having collected a lot of information about Chuchuna, Dravert came to a conclusion about the real existence of the so-called representatives of the human kind on the territory of Yakutia, which were about to become extinct. He also saw that there was absence in all those tales of description of women and children of these wild people. Interestingly, there was somebody else who published more information in the same magazine. His name was Xenofontov. He described that this belief in primeval people was because of Yakuts' beliefs in spirits which lived in the mountains and forests. And he provided Yakut terms to describe such animals. Now the Russians who had lived in a village Ruskaya Ustya in the along the Indirga River on the second half of the 20th century, they still believe in the spirit of the tundra. He had very long, he was very tall, and he would take local women to be his wives. People were afraid to have any relations with him because in the afterlife it wouldn't be so good for them. They also remember those people in Ruskaya Ustya about the bad Chukcha who would arrive from the Chukot nose territory. Sometimes at night they would come and steal horses. They also had bows and arrows, and they knew how to ride very quickly. For example, in the Yakutsk area of Laich, they had stories of the bad Chukcha, which they were also called Chuchuna. Now, the people in Ruskaya Ustya considered them to be enemies. A local representative of the tribe who could speak Russian had the following story. You know, Chukcha are people who wander around. They wander some years into our territory, our direction, and they go to Chukotka later. We kill them. They were very bad, but they also kill. There was a very interesting manuscript that still exists in Russia by a political prisoner under the Russian imperial times, Hudyakov, who described the area where he served. And this author speaks about rumors about existence of some wild people who are nomads in the local territory. They were not many in numbers. Sometimes they're dressed in rags, have bow and arrows, and their feet are very big. They fight with the local industrious people. They can throw rocks into the back of Yakut women. Now, Yakuts are very scared when they see such people. And people that he describes lived on the shores of the Arctic Ocean, in the Zhigansk Ulus, and to the west of it. And they're called in Tungus Huchana, which means those who run away. Now, that's interesting because according to the conclusions of the top Soviet specialists in ethnography of the North, from the Soviet Academy of Sciences, whose name was Gurvich, who passed away in 1992. He collected over 30 years information about such people as Chuchuna. All of this Chuchuna and the Muleni and the Bad Chukcha, they all most likely come from the so-called Chukcha of the North. During the hunt for the sea animals in the summer and in the fall, sometimes ice floes would break off and take those hunters, solitary hunters, far away to the west, to the shores of Yakutia. Having lost their relatives, people close to them, they were considered to be people out of touch and untouchable, so to say, because the Chukotka traditions forbid them to come back to their homeland, which they were already considered to be as dead, as deceased. So, having found themselves in the new, unusual situation, this Chukotka Robinson Crusoes were basically destined to die from starvation because they had no weapons to hunt wild animals. So they had to steal food and sometimes attack fishermen and hunters and perish because of that. Such types of bad local aborigines, I should say, or people, local people who are wild and angry, who attack others. It's very persistent in other mythology of other people. For example, in Greenland, there are Eskimos who are very much like Chuchuna, and they're called Tuni-Eat. Maybe they also borrowed from the Chukcha information. All this being so, this is interesting, but there is a little bit more about Chuchuna that I want to share. And this goes back to the information that I had back in 1991, I would say, and how the locals had interacted with them. This was at the end of the Soviet rule, and more information became available. And it came out from Yakutia as well. For example, from the northeast of Yakutia, the territories very close to Chukotka, like I said, we already mentioned Chukotka's people, and the Chuchuna information was coming from there. There was a student of the Yakutsk University who had observed Chuchuna, who was 3 meters tall, and he basically studied the footprints left by this creature. The young man found that they were 55 centimeters long. And a local, for example, there was a local worker who used binoculars and could see the movements of a creature who was taller than 3 meters and who could jump very long jumps, 3-4 meters long at the same time. And he found interesting footprints on the sand, which showed that they could leave deeper footprints than a human being. Other people in the area of Yakutia known as Kyukhari, or the Green Island, and the river of Hatis-Yuresk also actually observed and reported hairy relic hominoids. It was very interesting that if the Chuchuna was about 2 meters, then he would leave footprints about 35-40 centimeters. It was a young species, but older species having 3 meters in height would leave footprints about 1/2 meter or more in size. Very interesting altogether. There were a number of reports printed in the Yakutsk language in the local newspaper. I study a lot of information from Yakutia, and I remember reading some publications in Russian, of course, not Yakutsk language, from their central newspapers, even back in 1985 and 1988. What's more important about Chuchuna is the way they lived and what they used. Actually, what they used was a so-called northern boomerang. This was a very exotic weapon, and the information about it came to a Russian researcher, for example, Vladislav Deberdyov, actually from one of the hunters who had been hunting down Chuchuna in 1950s. This hunter's name was Nikolaev, and he was the one that told about the northern boomerang, which was made from the antlers, because the local snowman more often than not hunts down local deers. Now Chuchuna, after having made the boomerang, can throw the weapon in such a way that it would hit the ground, and bouncing from the ground like a ricochet, it would change the direction of the flight and get additional impulse or strength to bring down the target. This was very interesting because the most effective area for the direction of such boomerang or effectiveness was the soil that was not even. That's very interesting, and that's the local soil. Of course, we know that boomerang for ages had been considered to be the weapon of the Aborigines of Australia and wasn't really known somewhere else. However, what's interesting is that in 1980s, when the Polish archaeologists were excavating camps of the primeval hunters, deer hunters, in the cave in the area of the Blizova Gora, they actually found a European boomerang made from ivory. They could estimate its age to be 23,000 years. So if it was found in Poland, why not in Yakutia as well? Apparently, Chuchuna were not primitive people, according to the hunter who hunted them down, Nikolaev. That's why it's not right, he mentioned in the notes that I have, to call Chuchuna a wild person and even humanoid or anthropoid, because it's not dignified for us, and it's very, very not nice for our hairy relative, which could be considered to be a mutant. But what's more interesting is when the local Russians were tried to repeat the throw of the boomerang that Chuchuna did, they could not succeed. They could not do it. We just don't have enough knowledge about the laws of aerodynamics. Even, which they demonstrated, Chuchuna preparing the so-called primitive missile. We can't do the trajectory of the flight of the boomerang. We don't have the craft of the local Chuchuna people, and of course we don't have the strength that they had. There are many secrets or mysteries still connected to the people, to the snowman, Bigfoot, and people like Chuchuna. And it's very interesting how they could survive in the area of the Russian north, extreme north, where it becomes unbearably cold. My father served in the Soviet army in those areas. He described a lot of the how cold it could be, how people died from it. How would Chuchuna be able to survive in Yakutia and Chukotka? Well, according to the local people, they have their own belief. Those who know more about Chuchuna than just armchair scientists, they say that when it becomes extremely cold, Chuchuna goes into hibernation, just like bears. So hopefully we will find out more about Chuchuna and other wild inhabitants of the north, mutants or not, whoever they be. And in the future I'll tell you more stories about the Russian Bigfoot and other very unusual creatures that come from Russia and Eurasia. Thank you for your attention.